Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who've experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about sexual violence prevention education. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Education Coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. With me today, I have Dr. Alison C. Dr. Cares uses she, her pronouns and is an associate professor of sociology and member of the Violence Against Women faculty cluster at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Her career in the movement to end violence against women started over 20 years ago by working in community outreach in a domestic violence and sexual assault services agency. Her research often looks at campus sexual assault, including evaluation, the bringing in the Bystander in-person prevention program. So Dr. Cares, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much, Emily. I'm really excited to be here today.
And I also have Dr. Julia O'Connor. Dr. O'Connor uses she, her pronouns and is an assistant professor at the University of Central Florida in the School of Social Work, a member of the Violence Against Women faculty cluster, and has a secondary appointment in the Department of Population Health Sciences. Julia's practice experience includes many years as a domestic and sexual violence advocate. Her research interests include violence against women, focused on primary prevention of violence, campuses, those who perpetuate violence, and marginalized populations. Dr. O'Connor is also a volunteer at the VSC as well. So Dr. O'Connor, thank you as well for being here today.
Thank you, Emily. I'm super excited to be here and talk about this important topic.
I'm really excited to finally talk about violence prevention education because as the Education Coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida, my role is to normalize conversations about things like consent, sexual assault, boundaries, systems of power and control, etc., in an effort to prevent violence in Central Florida and beyond. And with things like the #MeToo movement, sexual violence is being talked about arguably now more than ever, which shows how far we've come as a society. However, sexual assaults still occur at alarming rates. For example, according to RAINN, every 73 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. Now, whenever I talk about my statistics, I do share that that's just reported numbers. So that's just what we know, and we'll get more into that later. So with that, today we are going to be going over how sexual assault prevention education currently looks, what works and what doesn't work in regards to teaching it, the possible future of prevention education, and little things we can all do every day to help end sexual assault. So with that, I just wanted to start off, how would you define prevention education?
This is Alison. I'm going to talk about this a little bit first, but I really like to be guided by the model that comes out of public health when I think about prevention education. So remembering that there's different levels of prevention and there's different groups that we're targeting for different things. So for example, a lot of what we do when we're in a job like what you have, Emily, which is a job like I used to have, is primary prevention, right? Where we're trying to address a public health issue before people have it, whether that's lung cancer or sexual violence, right? This can be applied to a lot of different things. But there's also what we call secondary prevention for those who are particularly at risk in terms of sexual violence, right? And then tertiary prevention, which you also can call intervention, right? So this is unfortunately sort of post-assault or post-experience education that we can give, because unfortunately sometimes this doesn't happen just once to somebody. And then, of course, I know we'll get into this, but there's a lot of different ways that education can look, but I try to keep those things in mind.
Yeah, so I think, interestingly enough, Alison and I had basically the same answer, really thinking about these different levels of prevention, right? Understanding that when we think of prevention, what we often think about is that we're trying to prevent something from actually occurring. However, with sexual violence, it's a little bit more complex, right? Because many people have been victimized. So sometimes we're actually working in both primary and secondary or even tertiary levels all at the same time without necessarily realizing it, depending on who is in our audience. But that we should really be thinking about, how do we stop violence from occurring? How do we change societal norms around violence? How do we address the drivers of violence? And how do we bolster or increase protective factors that protect people who might perpetrate or be victimized?
Well, I think the other thing to remember is it's also how, which particular type of prevention are you doing at which particular time, right? So we might have a whole grocery store of the things that we're going to do in prevention, but we're not doing all of them at the same moment, right? So that we have to be intentional about the risk factors, the things that make something more likely to happen that we don't want, and the protective factors, which make a good thing more likely and a bad thing less likely, because those differ. So are we aiming at lowering perpetration? Are we aiming at lowering victimization? Yes, those are the same precipitating incident, but we approach them differently. So we have to be really intentional in our prevention education about what is specifically the thing that we're aiming at, so that we're doing things that actually will lower sexual violence.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you both bringing in those other terms. So there's the primary, secondary, and what did you say, tertiary? Could you summarize that one more time for me?
Primary prevention is really what we often think of in terms of actual prevention. So working to prevent something before it occurs. So trying to stop sexual assaults, right? Primary prevention, how do we stop something from occurring? Secondary prevention is also stopping something from occurring, but actually working with groups who are at higher risk. So when we think of like campus sexual assault prevention, sometimes we work with, for example, fraternity men and sorority women, because we know that they're at increased risk for both victimization and perpetration. So these are groups that are at increased risks, and we try to intervene with those at-risk groups. And then tertiary prevention is actually, although we use the word prevention, it is more of an intervention, like Alison said, because it's with people who have already experienced some type of victimization. And often we're trying to intervene to prevent re-victimization, because we know that re-victimization among sexual assault survivors is very common. So often we're trying to prevent re-victimization, and also, as a social worker, and I think generally as people who want to help in general, we're also providing tools and services such as the Victim Services Center.
That's a really good point, Julia, that there is that re-victimization piece, because on my end, I was like, oh yeah, we kind of need to do these things in tandem. We obviously need to support survivors who have gone through violence while also trying to prevent violence from occurring. But I also didn't think of the re-victimization piece, where we're also preventing through our intervention with those who have experienced violence. We're also trying to prevent it from occurring again. That's really an interesting piece that I haven't thought of. I hear a lot about bystander intervention. What is a bystander? What is an active versus a passive bystander? I hear those terms a lot, and those are terms that I use in my own trainings. And is there actually a better term or a better word to use?
So, we've used the term bystander, and in some ways it is a misnomer, right? Because bystander education is about getting people who are witness to a situation, but I think we have to be clear about how broad that situation is, right? Because we're talking about before, during, and after sexual violence, right? So we're talking about those who are there, for example, when there's a rape supportive joke made in a locker room or at a family gathering, where it's when people are at a party and there's somebody who their behavior is really making a whole bunch of people uncomfortable, and maybe we should be paying a little bit more attention and, trying to create a distraction there. Bystanders are also the roommate that gets told after there's been an incident of sexual violence, right? So those are all bystanders, but really we want them to safely and effectively intervene in a supportive way. So I know there are other terms people are starting to use. I think the first thing we did was say pro-social bystanding to say what kind of bystander we wanted. And then there's folks saying upstander. And then there's some folks that are now calling this actionists, community actionists, which was a new term I wasn't familiar with, but I think those characterize a little bit more what we want people to do when we're doing these programs.
Yeah, kind of focusing on again, what we're looking for, like you were mentioning earlier, Alison, just, minimizing what we don't want to occur and then maximizing on things that we do want to occur. So focusing on what we want people to do. Do people also say like activists as well, or is it usually actionists that you've come across, just out of curiosity?
I have only seen actionists. I think activists we save for something different. And then I think, for the passive versus active, I think what's important about that is for people to realize it doesn't have to be that I go in and put myself in danger, right? There's lots of ways to bystand and intervene and I know people have used disruptors, not for sexual violence, but for other bystand, because bystander training now, of course, has spread to a lot of different things. I think all those are good, but especially I'm middle-aged now, so I have much less self-conscious about myself and much more comfortable with making a scene or making myself look stupid, right, to disrupt. And I think that's some of what's going on there, right? It can be texting the police or texting someone you need help for. There's a lot of different things. Some of the apps on campus, I know a campus I was on had one where you I can't remember the name of it, right? But you would put in where you were going and how long you thought it was going to take you to get there. And then if your roommates or friends or whoever you put on that didn't hear from you, right, they're supposed to do some first passive and then really active bystanding to figure out what's going on when you thought you were going into a risky situation. So lots of different ways that people can do this.
Yeah, I love that there's so many different options, because you're right. We're all coming from different perspectives, different times in our lives too. That's a good point too, Alison, about, some people might not be comfortable doing the direct approach, or maybe they would rather do the delegation, which is you're still jumping in. So it's always, I think that it's great that there's so many different options for someone to be an upstander or an actionist, like you were mentioning. So with that, how is prevention education presented currently? And I know that you both are working on at universities right now on campuses. So maybe we could start there. How is education for preventing sexual assault presented currently on campuses?
So I think this is Julia. A lot of it actually ties back to your previous question, which was very insightful of you to put this question after the bystander intervention question. So a lot of the prevention education that we do on campuses right now is bystander intervention training, right? This is one of the types of prevention intervention tools that we have that has demonstrated a lot of effectiveness in terms of the research, and not all programming to do prevention has demonstrated effectiveness at the same level that bystander interventions have. So we often do this type of training on campuses. What it looks like varies vastly from campus to campus. So a kind of usual approach is that during orientation, students will receive some type of brief bystander intervention training. That could be a video. It could be at my former institution at Rutgers, they had peer educators who would do a skit that would actually involve the audience with different scenarios. It could be people just talking about bystander intervention. So it varies vastly from campus to campus, but I would say this bystander intervention is probably the number one approach. Of course, there are multiple other things that are often different elements or add-ons or other types of trainings that are used, but I would say that is the number one that's used right now.
Would you agree, Alison?
Yeah, and I think so. I'm going to talk a little about the community aspect, even though, like Julia, a lot of my work has been focused on prevention on campus, on college campuses. What you're seeing now is the expansion of some of the evidence-based bystander intervention programs being expanded to general communities, right? To communities off our campuses. Certainly, our campuses interact with the community. We have many commuters on our campuses. There's different kinds of campuses that don't have dorms, but Green Dot is one of the sort of CDC supported and evidence-based bystander approaches. And that has now started being piloted in communities across the country, very different communities. And I think what's key about that is it's a community effort, right, of awareness raising and education, but it takes tons of different forms. And really, I think what looks like it's best is, all right, getting key folks together, right? Either sometimes you're looking for influencers in your community, right? Identifying who those are. But if you look at the places that it's been piloted in places like Alaska and places like New Hampshire, some have been rural, some have not been, right? Is you are seeing effectiveness again, where people are feeling like the norms that, as we talk about moving the needle, that the norms have changed. So I think that's promising because historically, the prevention education in the community has been public service announcements, right? Fundraisers, awareness raising. I don't think it's changed that much since when I was doing it a number of years ago, where it's, you will go and give a talk to whoever will have you. But that's not aiming at norms and attitudes and giving people tools for behavior, which is what we know people need, right? It does raise some awareness, but bystander is based on, okay, people have to be able to identify the problem, but then there's other stages, right? Then they have to see it as a problem that they have responsibility for helping to solve. And then they have to have the skills and comfort to actually help be a part of the solution. And, that certainly wasn't the kind of thing we could do in terms of community education on the old model. But it's really a wide community buy-in, not maybe the whole community, but you need a lot of different groups in the community committed to working together to get a bystander piece working in a larger community.
That's a really good point, and thank you both so much for shedding light on that. These prevention education on college campuses, when I went to college, it was a 2-hour kind of seminar. Is this still the case, or is it kind of a semester-long course usually?
Unfortunately, not a semester-long course. Usually we wish that it was, because we know that evidence shows that really a one-shot approach, like you're talking about that you got, Emily, this 2-hour lecture or whatever it was, is not enough. That actually people need booster sessions or repeat exposure, and they need different trainings to build off of the different skills that they have, chances to practice them. So this kind of one-shot approach is usual because there's just so much that colleges have to teach, right, students, and there's so much they're trying to do. But evidence really shows that there should be repeat exposure. At UCF, there are opportunities for example, students to get a certificate in kind of violence prevention, and they take a series of courses. But of course, those are voluntary, right? So not everybody has to go through that. They can't necessarily mandate all students going through that. But I think at least having those types of options where students can have repeated exposure to multiple different tools that they can use to intervene or prevent violence is a better approach than this one-shot approach.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Alison, did you want to jump in?
Well, and I think the hard part is the vast majority of these are done during orientation, because that is really the only time you have a captive audience and you can require it. But there's so much thrown at our students during orientation. They're trying to meet other people. They're learning everything. So, my real thing at orientation is make sure they know what the resources are on campus, like pound that. because really we're not going to have time I don't want to call it the mess, but in the chaos for them that is orientation, to have anything. You're not going to get movement on other stuff. It's too much. But then you have this challenge. The schools that have moved the needle some have a much more concerted effort, but that takes time and resources. And ideally, it should be across their time at the institution, because one thing we've seen is student social patterns change, right? What you're like as a first year and what your social patterns are as you're trying to figure out where you fit, and what it is junior and senior year, the spots for risk are different, right? And so we mostly get them as first years, and we're not necessarily addressing what they're going to see down the line a couple of years later.
These are all fantastic points. I remember when I got that training, or whatever you would like to call it. It was during my first few months. I don't remember most of it, but I actually became the peer educator. And that semester-long class, I feel like I learned so much from it. So that's why I wanted to kind of pose that question, because I agree. I think that repeat exposure and sitting with the concepts longer, I think, can prove more of an impact. And, a big piece to sexual violence prevention education is teaching about consent. So how are we currently teaching consent in education? And is there anything we should actually be improving on as educators?
That is a big question. And when you ask, is there anything we can be improving on? The answer is always yes. So maybe I'll back up and kind of start with the first piece first. And then I'm sure we both have a lot to say on how things can be improved on. So I do think, first of all, there has been improvement in this area from where we used to be. That we did really used to teach that that no means no. It wasn't even really an active consent, instead of understanding this idea of consent being an enthusiastic yes, or yes means yes. So now we understand that consent has multiple different pieces. It's not just a yes, but actually it has multiple different elements of it. These include that it's voluntary, right? So that it's not coerced. It's something you want, that you're saying yes because you want to. That it's mutual, meaning both parties are consenting. It's unambiguous, meaning it's not a yes with a question mark. It's a full enthusiastic yes. It's coherent and informed. So you think about the role that alcohol and drugs might have, right, in terms of that. It's reversible, meaning that you can say yes and then you can say no. And it's ongoing and specific, meaning that you don't get consent once and then there's always consent with that person from then on, and also specific to different acts, right? So I think the way that we now look at consent is really grown a lot since that no means no, it really has all of these different kind of elements. And maybe I'll just, since I said I could go on all day about the ways that I want to improve anything in the world, you could ask me and I could probably go on all day about how I can improve it. But specifically this, I'll just touch on one point. And that is that I think sometimes when we talk about consent education, that we really focus on risk of victimization and how do you reduce risk of victimization, instead of talking about what healthy sexuality looks like, and this idea of an enthusiastic party, instead of saying this is how you reduce your chance of violence victimization, then you've actually taken the sex out of sex ed. You're talking about something else entirely. You're making it about violence. And while that's very important, if we don't also teach kind of the flip side in terms of what a healthy relationship looks like, what healthy sexuality looks like, what pleasure looks like, right? Then we're not teaching the full picture. We're just teaching like a very small piece of it. And I think without that kind of deeper understanding, we're doing a disservice to students and those people that we educate, because we're only really teaching them about the negative aspects of this area. And I know that this is very kind of controversial and not necessarily something that a lot of people feel comfortable getting into, but I do think it is necessary to kind of tackle this and wrestle with these ideas and think about a more holistic sexual education.
Yeah, and I just have to echo what Julia has said, because consent without the context, and thank you, Julia, for such a great way of defining consent. That's one of the best I've heard. It's really not that helpful, right? And lack of knowledge opens you up to risk and coercion, right? And I think this is I'm going to say it's a part of a larger societal problem, as many folks in the US are not comfortable openly talking about sexuality. We may be in a very sexualized society, but people aren't comfortable talking about sexuality, and they're not comfortable talking about sexuality and sexual activity with the generation coming up, be it their kids or other children that are in their lives, right? But I remember back to some of my days doing community outreach and what that meant for kids, right? So I worked a lot with pregnant and parenting teen programs, as they were called at the time. And what was really fascinating to me is these were supposed to be healthy relationships, workshops, but how quickly it devolved into sex education, because it was so clear what these young women didn't know. So these are young women who've had a baby already. Some of them have had two, but they could not actually tell you which of the sexual activities they'd engaged in were ones that were a risk for pregnancy, let alone STIs, like sexually transmitted, right? And oftentimes their partners were much older. And, but no one had taught to them about sex. No one had taught to them about good sex. No one had taught to them about bad sex. No one had taught to them about what consent is. No one had taught to them about what sex is supposed to be, should be like, what it shouldn't be like, what it shouldn't involve. And then when a partner tells you what it should involve, and you have a relationship with them, that makes sense to you. But super, right, obviously some really, impactful outcomes. And that I think I was a pretty naive young person. I was not that much older than these young women when I was doing this. And it was that has always stuck with me, because certainly, is this my favorite conversation to have? Not necessarily, right? But is it, it really drove home how very important that conversation was to have. And then I think about something we talked about before the podcast, right? That how inclusive the consent conversation has to be, and the sexual health conversation has to be, because even in the places where it does happen, right, it's really often just about heterosexual sexual intercourse and nothing else. And that is important to know about, as are a whole bunch of other things for those, right, who don't identify that way. And I don't think we're doing that at all, but that may be why you see particular risk for our LGBTQ plus populations in this area of sexual violence.
These are all such important points. I think it just drives home how education needs to be individualized, and it also everyone needs to be part of the conversation. Everyone needs to be involved in it. And yeah, there's so much to unpack about what you both said. And I don't think that it is actually very controversial, in my opinion. Julia, I think that that makes a lot of sense, that we should be talking about it in that aspect as well. The other piece to the conversation, definitely. With that, I'd like to also ask, what age do you think consent education should start at? And how should it be presented? Is there really an age that would be too early for these kinds of topics?
I have a teenager, so I'm going to start. It's never too early, right? It has to be age appropriate. But even before they have language, right, you should be introducing the ideas of that your body is your own, right? And what you can say yes and can say no to, and not forcing kids to. And I know people, you see these on Facebook and social media all the time, like, don't make them hug grandma, grandpa, right? Don't, right? Yes, we want to raise polite children who are empathic, but that includes having the right to say things about their own body. And so, as they start talking, and as we talk to kids, your private body parts are your private body parts, but they don't need nicknames, right? They need to be able to say the words that their body parts are and be comfortable saying that. And right, I remember one of my kids' pediatricians was so good about this when she would do their physicals and say, right, your private parts are typically the parts that are covered by your bathing suit. And I'm going to check them to make sure you're healthy. And that's okay, because we're in here with mom and I'm explaining this, and you can ask me anything you want to ask. Great. right? And that's when they were like 4 or 5, we started with her. So, again, like Julie said, I could go on, but, the conversation has to get more detailed, right? And more explicit as they get older. Waiting to do sex ed till high school and talk about these things till high school is too late, right? You want to be, it's prevention, right? We're talking prevention education. So you want to be talking about these things before kids encounter them. And oh, by the way, they're starting to go through puberty before then. And there's all kinds of things they're talking to each other about. And I will be honest, God only knows what is going around on their texting and group chats and everything. So we've got to be in there and be a trusted voice before some of that misinformation comes in.
Yeah, I mean, I can only echo what Alison has said in multiple different points, but one of them is like, no, in my book and many people's books, like we should start as soon as people are born, cradle to grave, right? That we should be doing this type of education, really. And again, that doesn't mean that we're using scary words like rape with toddlers. It means that it's age appropriate. And then Alison also pointed out that by the time they get to high school, it's too late. And I would echo that sentiment with college, right? That often in college is the first time people are getting sexual violence prevention education. For sure, it's too late if you're first hearing about it in college, because we know that many people experience sexual assault during high school. So we actually have a lot of college students coming in who have already been victimized. So that we can work when we were talking about, primary, secondary, tertiary prevention. That's why sometimes we're actually working we may think that we may be working kind of on a primary level, but that we're actually working with students who have already been victimized. So that we need to recognize that this type of education really, really should be starting much earlier than we're doing it currently.
And I think that's why it's critical that sometimes people don't understand why folks have to be trained in some crisis intervention if they're going to be a prevention educator. But it's exactly that, right? Because this is horrible for all of us, but how early so many people have an experience with sexual abuse or sexual assault. So, I'm not sure there's any room I ever talk in that there's not some tertiary prevention that would be going on. And that's why you have to also educate your educators on the 3 levels of prevention, because actually they are going to be doing all 3.
It makes a lot of sense, especially when we look at things like statistics, of course, with a grain of salt. But yeah, it makes sense. And also we haven't even begun to really talk about sexual abuse too. We were talking about, sexual assault happening in before someone becomes a college student, but also survivors that are, that were sexually abused as children as well. We have to be more proactive than reactive, because that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to prevent things like sexual violence holistically. I also, Julia, you brought it up already a little bit about how prevention education has kind of evolved, and you've been hinting at it too, Alison, but one of the things that you brought up, Julia, was moving from no means no to yes means yes. Are there other kind of things that you wanted to bring up as far as how prevention education has evolved, how some things have changed?
I can start, and then I know that Alison has some other things I think to add around good touch, bad touch in particular. I know you've talked about that before, but just because I've been saying like, oh, there's so much room for improvement, I do want to also kind of highlight things that we're doing well, and that is that this type of education exists now, and it didn't exist before. When I was in college, Emily, you're talking about, I went through a 2-hour thing at orientation. I mean, I was in college a long time ago and my memory is terrible. So maybe I did go through a 2-hour thing and I don't remember it, but I literally don't remember going through anything. I don't think I did. In college when I was on campus, I was part of a women's group that was active in documenting stories of students' sexual assault and writing them down by hand in a book, so that we could bring them to the administrators and say sexual assault is a problem on this campus, because it wasn't talked about at all. And there was no campus climate survey that was kind of looking at the rates of students being sexually assaulted. There wasn't prevention education. There was nothing, but students were getting, of course, sexually assaulted at the same rates, about 1 in 4 women, right, by the time that they graduate. So I'm just going to, because I have so many things to say about where things could be improved, I just wanted to highlight that at least we're having this discussion. We're here. there's these types of programs. Emilie, you have a job doing this. So there's improvement in that way, at least.
And I'm even older than Julia. So no, there was nothing. I can confidently say there was nothing. But when there were optional things, they can really be summed up as it was guys don't rape, women do these things not to get raped. I mean, that simplistically is what it was. And as I've always said, if that was going to work, it would have worked by now, because we did that for like 20 years and that didn't work. So I do think, yeah, there's a long way to go, but I want to echo what Julia said, we have come a long way. People talk about this now, right? Even, again, I have a high schooler. She and her friends have talked about this, and not just because I'm her mom, right? This is stuff that comes up. And then when you talk about sort of younger kids and child sexual abuse, we have seen a shift there, because when we did finally do education with little kids, it was good touch, bad touch, which I applaud absolutely what it was. But the unfortunate part, right, is good touch, bad touch can be confusing for kids, especially small kids, because sometimes what are bad touches can actually feel good because our mind and our bodies are not in complete alignment. And that's easy for those who are perpetrating the abuse to sort of manipulate. So I know one of the shifts that there's been is now talking, it's more focused, I think, on the grooming versus the act, right? So it does talk to them about their bodies, but a lot of it is about swell secrets and tell secrets, and trying to help kids differentiate between what those are, which I think gets more at the contact, right, or the non-sexual piece of the abuse. I don't know of any evaluation on that, although it certainly may be out there, but at least I would say that seems like a step in the right direction that acknowledges more of the complexity of how this goes for kids.
Definitely. And could you actually define the swell secrets versus tell secrets?
The swell secrets versus tell secrets. So swell secrets, they give them a lot of examples, right? So a swell secret would be, I got this great present for your friend Emilie for her birthday. And I was so excited I had to tell somebody, but we can't tell Emilie. That's a swell secret, right? I'm trying to think of some of the examples in the trainings of tell secrets, right? Tell secrets are anything that really include a veiled threat, which you have to explain to kids, right? Like, I might not be able to, if you tell anybody about this, they might not let us hang out and go out for ice cream anymore. So you don't want to tell anybody. That's a tell secret, right? And so in my experience, what it is it's lots and lots of giving kids, they give them a definition, but it's lots of those giving examples. Anything that makes you uncomfortable about a secret is probably a tell secret. And really that it's to err on the side of telling than on the side of keeping the secret.
That makes a lot of sense. And I can see why they bring in that aspect to it. That's super important. And yeah, I think a lot of times I'm hearing a lot more about grooming in general. So I'm glad that we're seeing those progresses. And I do want to uplift again that, yeah, I think that even when I was going to the University of Illinois, I had seen a shift already in how aware people were when I was I was there about 2-3 years, doing the education, I should say. But at the beginning, kind of introducing concepts such as rape culture and things like that, people had never kind of heard of victim blaming and things like that. But by the end of my career there, they had. And so there was already kind of a shift while I was there itself. And so I do want to uplift that. Yeah, there is change happening, but like I like to say, it's more of a marathon than a sprint. We talked about, in regards to sex education, there were people who you were working with teens that had already had children, but they hadn't known a lot about sex. And so there's a shame around it, right? That you were mentioning, as far as a society, we're a sexualized society, but we don't really talk about it. And then people are misinformed and things like that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about stigmas and myths surrounding sexual assault prevention education, and if there were any that you wanted to address. This is probably one of those things that we can go on and on about as well.
I can start, and yes, I could go on and on. So I'll pick my one and try and just stick to that. So I think one of the myths that is most pervasive is that this is a women's issue, right? That when we are talking about sex, or if we are talking about sexual violence, that this is an issue that pertains to women, that women are involved with, and women need to be educated about, and that men shouldn't be involved and are not involved. So it is somewhat of a myth in that is not true. Unfortunately, the reality says that most of the people actually active in the field are women. Most educators, most of the students who go voluntarily to sexual violence prevention events are women. So there's some truth in the myth, but that's not because that's the way it should be. This is absolutely an issue that affects men, and that we need men's engagement in order to make any progress, right? So men can be victimized, and men can also be perpetrators. Therefore, we need them in the room. We need them as allies. We know that the majority of men don't commit sexual assault. And so we need those men to be invested in these issues, right? And work as allies in the movement to stop sexual violence. So I think the one myth that I'll really hone on is that men should, that they might feel uncomfortable if they come to these types of events, or that they don't want to be involved. I teach a violence against women class in the School of Social Work at UCF. And I do have some men, because it's a master's level social work class, so I do have some men that come. But of course, the majority of the people in the room are women. However, when you go and work with clients as a social work student as well, they're all going to work with sexual violence survivors, right? That there's no way that you can be a social worker and work with clients and not work with a survivor. So that this is absolutely an issue that men need to be educated in, and that they really should be our allies kind of in the movement as well.
And I'm going to stay in the theme of those who identify as male, right? And then I think one of the myths that's incredibly damaging, not just for sexual violence, but actually for relationships overall, is this idea of men always wanting sex all the time and women not wanting, right? Like this differential, and that men therefore can't control themselves and are not responsible for that. Right, that men are not, and that shortchanges men too, right? In those who are suspected of being perpetrators, those who could experience sexual violence, right? So that drives me a little bit nuts, right? I think I really do like to center the experiences of women, right? I'm a violence against women researcher, but I think that we have such a narrow way of being a man, right, in many cultures, including our own, and masculinity, in a way that hurts everybody. It hurts everybody of all genders, right? And men lose too. And I try to work with my students on that. Like there needs to be more ways of being who we are, including what it means to be a man. And so I think that's a really big ball of wax to try and deal with, and it would touch a lot of different issues, but this one, like if we can't get around that and starting to have more models of masculinity, that's going to continue to be a persistent problem for us.
I couldn't agree more. I think that a lot of this stems from that very small, tight gender box that people find themselves having to squish into. And then with that, it leads to everything that you were saying, Alison and Julia. So I agree. I think that that's super important, that to break down that stigma, that this isn't just a quote unquote woman's issue. And of course, that's leaving out gender nonconforming individuals. That's leaving out other people in the conversation too. And we all need to kind of be in this together. It does affect everyone. And also we do need to kind of come together, like you were mentioning in the beginning, in order to prevent it. I know that both of you do a lot of research in this area. So through said research, what have you found works? And we talked a little bit about it. What have you found works in prevention education and what doesn't? Is teaching risk reduction techniques promoting this victim blaming mentality, for example? Are there ways we can reduce our risk in a non-blaming or shameful way? Things like that.
That's an interesting question. And I think there's both philosophical and research-based pieces of that, and the overlap between them, because In fact, many of those who've experienced a victimization, whether it's a sexual victimization or not, one of the real theories about why victimization has can have such a negative impact on people's outcomes is it really undermines our sense of control and how the world works, right? Bad things aren't supposed to happen to good people, right? But what we do see is sometimes whether it be a victim services worker, whether it be a police officer, whether it be a friend, right? For many folks, giving very concrete things that they can do does actually help people who've already experienced a victimization feel like they're more in control, right? For example, self-defense classes have been found to actually be helpful for those who've experienced sexual violence, right? And I think even for those who haven't, if it helps cut down on fear, right? Women do live in a lot of fear of sexual assault, right? In oftentimes very subtle and unconscious ways. I ask my students, like, okay, so the new Marvel movie is coming out and it's playing at midnight because, right, that's the earliest okay, so this is a pre-COVID example, right? It's the earliest it can be shown at a movie theater and you're going, where do you park? There's always a very, very clear gender split. And then you ask them, okay, why? It's interesting. By and large, the women in my class have put a ton of thought into it. And it's about lighting. It's about where your car, how far it is from the movie theater to your car, all these things. The men, to the extent that they thought about it at all, it's because they have a nice car and so they parked far away so nobody would dig the doors, right? Or they haven't thought about it at all. Now, there are exceptions, but that's a pattern that holds a lot. So I am very wary of education that's just about risk reduction. It does have I don't know if we call it risk reduction, but giving that feeling of control by saying, here are some things you can control, evidence has shown that can actually be helpful for folks.
I appreciate you saying that, Allison. I know a lot. I've been in classes before where presenters are asking, okay, what women in the room, what do you do to protect yourself against sexual violence? And they just keep writing over and over again on the board. And then they're like, okay, men in the room, what do you do? And there's just crickets. And I think it's going back to, that's obviously there's some holes in that, right? In the sense that there's this idea, again, that this doesn't affect men. And it does. We know that it does. But Julie, I didn't know if you had anything that you wanted to jump in on.
Yeah, I mean, I think Allison has really highlighted a lot of important points. That risk reduction, while it has some benefit, it cannot be the only tool that we have in our toolbox, right? That often it's an easy intervention that we think, with our students, we can teach them about self-defense or about how to protect your drink so that you don't get a roofie in it. Things that seem simple and are so manageable and are in somebody's control. But that's just such a small piece of what we need to be talking about. That if we only focus on prevention education, that tells women how to protect themselves or would-be survivors how to protect themselves and doesn't look at the flip side of that, which is how do we actually stop those who would perpetrate from perpetrating, that we're never going to do what actual primary prevention is, right? That primary prevention is trying to stop something before it occurs. Even if women are able to protect themselves, there are still people who are perpetrating out there. You haven't stopped them, right? So that it's a very small piece, and it is a tool that we can employ, but by no means should it be the only tool that we employ. And if we are just doing that, it is, a type of victim blaming in a sense, in that we're saying that women are now responsible for preventing their own sexual assault instead of looking at larger societal factors that are driving sexual assaults driving sexual assaults to occur, rape culture and all of those other more societal factors that we need to be getting at.
And I think this is where the bystander piece comes in, right? Because realistically, we've had the least success with education with those who perpetrate, right? But we have a lot of success with those who can help in a lot of ways. And so, if we have limited resources, that's really where it does need to go, right? Because each one of us can absolutely play a role here, because I think it's also sensitizing people to realize there's a whole bunch of places where you probably there was sexual violence going on or the risk for it, and you didn't realize it because I will be honest, I'm somewhat skeptical that we can identify who the perpetrators or potential perpetrators are and change their behaviors. But sometimes their behavior gets changed by the norms around them changing, right? We think that there's some testing that they go through, right? Telling jokes, right? Doing some what we would call low level but still harmful things, and seeing how those around them react, right? This is but like, is this a setting in which I can go further, right? And, I'm not talking about like committing a sexual assault in front of people, but like, is this a place where I can do this, right? Or not? And especially getting people to see that those lower level things, because what we know is a lot of people don't even intervene when they see the really high level things. I mean, you do have the case for Chanel Miller, right, where those two graduate students were like, that does not look right to me, and I'm going to do something about it. But I think there are lots of times where people continue past that dumpster and whatever's going on because they're not quite sure, and we have these norms of privacy, right? But I think that's where we have the most potential for change, which is why I'm happy to see the shift to the bystander and the community focus.
Absolutely. And I'm hearing that those who perpetuate either rape culture or rape itself, this like testing of the boundaries kind of thing going on is something that we can nip in the bud as bystanders and say, hey, what you're doing isn't okay, and addressing it. With that, you mentioned that, is it true then, that was my other question actually, does prevention education not work for perpetrators of violence, or is there any kind of prevention education that does actually work for perpetrators?
Unfortunately, the research in this area is really mixed, and we don't have we can't hold up one program like we can with bystander intervention and say, look, this has been tested in multiple different formats, whether you're doing green dot or bring in the bystander, and it works. We can't do that with this type of interventions for perpetrators. There are some that have been shown to reduce perpetration. A lot of those are bystander intervention programs have been shown to reduce perpetration. In part, we think by actually addressing some of these norms that Alison was talking about, so that we know that bystanders are supposed to intervene at various different levels. And one of those levels is actually when assault is not occurring, but there is something going on, like a joke or something in the culture that is increasing tolerance of sexual violence. And so in having bystanders intervene in that way. Some of the kind of factors that we know are probably the most malleable, or the ones that we're most able to change in terms of perpetrators, have to do with these peer norms and with alcohol use, which is related to peer norms. So that is something that we've looked at and had kind of the most success with, is if you change peer norms within a group, so that you are able to actually reduce the tolerance of violence. And so there are studies that look at alcohol use, for example, and have students guess how much they think their peers drink. And then they're shown the actual fact of how much their peers drink, which is less. And then they actually change their behavior around their drinking, right? And so this same idea that we adjust our behaviors on what we think our peers are doing. So if we think our peers are tolerant of sexual violence, are perpetrating, are endorsing rape myths, then we're more likely to do it ourselves. So there's some evidence that kind of adjusting these social norms, these social norm trainings, can do some good. That's preliminary evidence. And I would also say there's some interventions as well that look at kind of high risk groups. So again, thinking of the secondary prevention, but high risk groups in terms of alcohol use, and looking at men who are high alcohol users and trying to intervene with this group to help reduce sexual violence perpetration.
That's incredible. And I think that is just amazing to know. I think that's really, it makes a lot of sense that, we're social creatures, and also the idea that, it's exciting to know that there is evidence-based prevention education, that there really is change happening. And I'm so glad to hear that kind of peer norm shift is effective. So that's great to hear. Which kind of leads me to my other question, which is I think that there is a lot of ideas that maybe, we're not making these changes. So what would you say to someone who thinks violence prevention education does not help prevent sexual assault, and no matter what, things like rape, racism, homophobia, things like that will continue?
I think I have those days when I am that person, right? There are the days that are frustrating sometimes when you've spent a large part of your life on these things, and then you see the paper or you see the comments, right? There's something covered in the news, and you see the comments down below, which my partner keeps going, you need to not read this. It just makes you angry. It's not a representative sample. I'm a quantitative researcher, right? So my kids are always throwing that back in my face. But I think the thing is that is how can we make the evidence we do have of what works? Because no, we don't have all the answers, but we have some answers. How can we get those translated, right? A lot of these are in academic journal articles, which are hard to read. I don't always live in them, that are paywalled, right? That's not going to work. How do we get this information out to our communities in a way that is what they need to know? And I will be honest, I'm not always good at that, right? I mean, part of that is why it's nice to do campus-based stuff, because I am in my community and it's a little easier to have, we have a captive community. But I think that's one of the things we really need to think about, and that maybe, even though I'm a bit of a dinosaur on this, right, we have some real opportunities. While there can be great evil, right, from social media, where is the great promise that we can harness there on these things? Because, well, I'm not going to convince everybody that we can get rid of this and that these are problems. I think we can convince more people that the things that they can do actually make a difference and can get us less sexual violence and a lot of other related issues, right? Sexual violence, when we think about bystander education, how important it is to understand that it has to be individualized, because it's not the same, for example, for some of our communities of color, what they can do to bystand, because they may not want to call the police, because that may be a bigger problem than what they think they're seeing, right? So we have to be very aware of all the things that people come to sexual violence education as the whole people that they are and the experiences they've had. So that, there's that piece as well in terms of when we are getting the word out, okay, how does this look for you? What can this look like for you? We can tell you the basics, but how does this operationalize? How does this actually work in the real world?
I think just to add on to that too, in terms of problems of academia perhaps, because Alison said one of the problems is that we publish our research right in these academic journals that nobody, including academics, want to read. And so how do we translate that so that other people know what's going on? And so it's not only a problem of translation, but it's also a problem of scaling up, so that we have these interventions, right, that are done. Green Dot is really well known in our community, and it's done on campuses and a little bit on communities. It's done in high schools, right? But it's not done in all of them. And it's done, bystander intervention, as we've discussed in the beginning, is sometimes done as a 1-hour thing at orientation. And that is not the same as taking a Green Dot program and putting it into a high school, right? So that how do we scale up the programs that are working? How do we take the programs that are working and put them everywhere? How do we teach bystander intervention right at our workplace? I know that there's programming working with bartenders in order to be active bystanders, right? So how do we think creatively about getting these interventions out of the little kind of silos that they're in? Again, working in colleges is really easy because it's a captive audience, as Alison said. So students are mandated to go to orientation so we can talk to them then. How do we talk to people who aren't mandated to come to our trainings? How do we get them invested in this? So really thinking about how we engage people and how we kind of hook them in so that they're interested and that they're willing to be part of this kind of movement to end sexual violence.
And I think our job is to really identify what the active piece is, because the reality is the smaller we can make this and still be effective, we have to be efficient and streamlined in this, right? So I think that's one place we can contribute, but we can't do that without doing partnered work with the community, right? So, sometimes we test these things, but there's lots of resources, right? It doesn't have what we in the academic community call ecological validity, which is really, is it going to happen this way in the real world when it's not part of the study? So I think that's one place where that is what we can help with, but then we've got to figure out, okay, but again, scalable, but small, like how small can it get and still be effective? And I know people don't like when I say that, but I think we have to be realistic.
That's a really fair point. And yeah, I want to uplift too that you were kind of talking about specific barriers, right, that people may have when becoming a passive and then a active bystander. And I think that that's really important. And just kind of, what does this look like to you? Kind of meeting them where they're at. And then, yeah, I love when talking about little things that people can do, because they can have a huge impact. And then I want to uplift to the idea of this paywall. That's a really good point. And I love what you said, Julia, making academic journals that even academics don't want to read. So absolutely, how can we normalize having these conversations in general, and then uplifting these different kind of actions that people can take and to make these making these changes that we know evidence shows that does actually make a difference. I also wanted to ask, why we've been talking about different systems of power and control. So things like racism and homophobia and things like that. So why is it important to address these other systems of power control when educating on sexual assault violence prevention?
I would say because none of them exist in a vacuum. We use the word intersect a lot because we talked about intersectionality, intersectional work. We are the lived human beings we are, with all of the things that we are. And the sexual violence that happens to us or that we are a witness to is a part of that whole package, right? How I view that, what I see as how it impacts my life, who I can go to for help, all of that depends on who I am. Right? What privileges I have, what barriers I have, how I think those support places might view me, right? And if that's going to make me feel better or worse, and if it's even worth it, right? Certainly I think of it as a prevention educator, right? Julia already brought this up. This has largely been actually, and I'll be a little more specific, a middle and upper class white women, cisgender white heterosexual women's movement, right? That's not our community. We're a part of that, of a community that's larger. And so, I think we need to take a hard look of, okay, well, why not? And we can look at Me Too, right? Me Too was not Alyssa Milano's. Me Too was Tarana Burke's, right? And so I think that's a perfect example of why all these things have to be taken together as the whole people that people are.
I think too, and absolutely building on that point, is that these things are not siloed, so that we don't have somebody who is a perpetrator of sexual assault who just holds hostile views against women. Usually these things are overlapping, that they intersect on both ends. So like take, for example, the killings that happened in Atlanta, right, of Asian women. The majority of those victims were Asian and they were women. And the killer of those women said that the reason that he was doing it is because he was having some sort of sexual addiction and wanted to get rid of the women that were causing this conflict, right? So he is clearly articulating a hostility towards women. And although he won't admit it, because I think he doesn't want to get charged with a hate crime, he clearly has a racial motive as well, right? So that we see that the majority of people who commit mass killings have some sort of history of domestic violence or violence against women, right? So we know that these kind of issues, they don't exist in silos. There's research showing that people who endorse rape myths, for example, are more likely to also endorse other types of isms such as racism and homophobia. And so we know that these are all intersecting issues. And so we can't address one without addressing the other.
And I think sometimes, this is what we're focused on, but this may have happened to somebody, this is an experience somebody had in their life, but where they prioritize it in the challenges that they're facing may not be in the same way that I would, right? It may be that there are other things that they're like, that wasn't good. This was a much more pressing problem in my life, right? It's always hard when I look out at anybody I talk to, or I look out at my class and the assumptions that we have, right? And I know there's survivors in all my classes. It's a college campus, so let's be honest, it's probably about 25% of my students. But I also have those who've perpetrated it in all my classes, and that is far more uncomfortable and I'm not saying I know who they are, but the reality is it's probably some students I've liked in the past. We all probably have somebody in our life that we like, care about, and have enjoyed their company who has perpetrated sexual violence. We don't talk about that because that's really hard to face. So all these things go into it, right? So yes, sometimes I think it's a little bit clearer, like the example that Julia gave. But I think that's what we're looking for perpetrators to look like. And those who perpetrate are people who have done this. And I'm not trying to excuse it, but we've got to understand that all this is going on for all the folks that are involved, and that those of us who are bystanders as well.
Definitely. And going off of that, again, how we do have the power to kind of shift these norms, especially since we probably do know people who not only are survivors of the violence, but also perpetuate the violence. Is there a way that we could be practicing prevention education outside of a classroom setting? So what are those little things that you were mentioning, Alison? And of course, Julia, you can jump in too. What are those little things that we could all be doing in our daily lives to help prevent sexual violence?
I think we have a lot of work to still identify what those are, right? But I think disrupting, interrupting actions, right? Those jokes are not okay. Right. And learning the language, much like we've talked about how to do anti-racist work more in the last year than probably we've talked about in a long time. What are the strategies you can use that work for your skill set? And let's improve our skill set, right? Many people are parents, right? How are you talking to your kids from when they're little all the way up? How are you talking to them about their relationships? How are you talking to your friends about their relationships? Right? What are you asking when you have suspicions? Right? But I can't say that I have evidence to back up that those are effective, right? Because when we're talking about the whole community and what we do outside a closed, controlled environment that we can study, it gets much harder. But I will say, I hope, and I think I have reasoned belief that those are things that won't hurt and certainly could help.
I think too, just to add on, because I definitely agree with all of those, and kind of being the bystander in your daily life, right? Saying something if you hear the joke, all of those types of things, absolutely. And then also thinking about what we do when we hear stories of sexual violence and how we react and what we say about the survivors, right? So what do we say when somebody discloses to us that they've experienced something? Is it, I'm really sorry that happened to you. How can I help you? Or is it, well, why were you out at 1 o'clock by yourself drinking? What are we doing in terms of that victim blaming as well? Even when we read a story or we watch a TV show, how are we discussing the actions of the survivor with our friends, with our colleagues? Are we discussing them in a way that we're saying, well, I just don't understand why she acted like that after that happened? Or is it that really raised a lot of good points and now I have to think about this? So just really thinking about as well, because you're going to hear stories of sexual violence, right? And so how do we react to them? And are we subtly blaming the victim when we hear those types of stories, or not so subtly too?
And actually, Emilie, that brings me back to a question you had before about like myths and stigmas. And the myths about how someone who's been sexually assaulted should react, I also think is really problematic. And because it has been framed as a women's issue, you do get a lot of women who I think get defensive in a way of how can I keep this from happening to me? So like, if I can figure out why that happened to you and I wouldn't do those things, I'm going to be fine, instead of being supportive. So and this extends to law enforcement, prosecutors, therapists, right? Because I am not a clinician, but was amazed how little stuff about trauma, particularly sexual trauma, many therapists are trained in, right? And that they hold these myths about if you were, and you can't see my air quotes, really sexually assaulted or really raped, then you would be reacting this way. So that's a big one that I think somehow I think Me Too has helped with that, but still I think people are expecting someone to be hysterical, report right away, and all of that.
Definitely. I that is one of the main topics that I go over in our trainings, which is the many different ways that a person could react to trauma and how that they're very normal reactions, and that the list that I'm providing is not complete and no one's going to feel all of those things too, because I think that there's this idea that, oh, if they don't react this way, then what happened probably wasn't either that impactful or it didn't happen, which we all know we should start by believing. We should believe survivors. And then, breaking down this victim blaming mentality is super important. So I love these little things that you can do. And of course, I always like to uplift that you can always read up more about sexual violence and trauma as well, and just learn more about it too, so that when someone does disclose, these are things that are helpful to say, reacting responsibly, and then that helps someone on their healing journey. You might be the first person they are talking to about this. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think research shows that, if you react responsibly, they can start their healing journey a little sooner than rather than later. I just a few more questions here. I was kind of curious to know how COVID may have impacted prevention education, if at all.
So Emily, I think you're better answering that than we are, right? Because I can tell you how it impacted researching about it. But I'm not on the ground anymore. I mean, I have some hypotheses, but actually it would probably be great if Julia may have something she wants to say too, but if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. So essentially, when it comes to prevention education, I found on the grounds, first off, there have been less opportunities to do prevention education. A lot of the places that those at-risk populations and things like that, they may not have access to Zoom or a virtual setting. So there's less opportunities that people are reaching out for, because I think this conversation has a lot of anxiety around it in general, but I think the added anxiety of figuring out, okay, I can hook you up onto this, and we have a conference room and I'll try to hook you up here. And I think that there's just less education going on. And at the same time, there's more, because we're doing reaches that we never have had before. So this platform is actually, people from 23 different countries are actually listening to this podcast. I have people listening all over the country itself. And so it's very interesting. It's both. There's less and there's more. I also find, and I think you as educators can hop on this as well, there, part of that prevention education that you were mentioning, which is, the crisis intervention piece to it. I believe, and again, I started this right when COVID started, so I didn't do a lot of in-person, but I would assume that there's a lot less disclosures when you do a virtual training than when you do one in person. And that is a very important piece to violence prevention education, is being there, kind of hanging out after the training, and someone might come up to you and share, and then you're able to refer them to resources and make sure that they get the help that they need. And so there's that. And I also find that there's just less participation in general. I find that participation is very important in education, especially, we were talking about, like, how can we make this bystander intervention, cater to you? What does bystander intervention look like to you? And kind of going off of that. But I don't know if you had anything you wanted to hop in on as far as participation and things like that.
I do know that, at least anecdotally, from what I've been hearing on our campus at UCF, is that students, maybe there's less kind of, somebody's able to go to a classroom and talk about that. that it does kind of equalize out in some ways students' ability to access this. If it's via Zoom, people are more likely, and I don't know this for sure about at the end of the pandemic. I think at the beginning, people were more likely to attend a training, right? Because they don't have to go somewhere and attend it. I think now maybe that is petered off. Maybe it's just my experience, but I am Zoomed out and I'm not interested in going to any more Zoom workshops. But it does kind of allow people, like you're saying, you have people from all these different countries who are able to access something that they wouldn't be able to access before.
And I wonder if there are lessons for us, like what did we learn from COVID that can go on and enhance our education efforts afterwards, and what can't, right? Because you can think of participation two ways. There's the participation of people actually talking, but there's the participation of how many are coming, right? Like Julie is talking about, and how are we going to meld these things together once, God willing, we all can be safely in an inside group setting again. So I think that's an unanswered question, but I'm really interested in hearing from those doing prevention education. Okay, what lessons have we learned that we think we can continue to use in a non-pandemic situation that will enhance what we do?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of tools that we have had to sort of, I know that the VSC specifically, we had part of our strategic plan was to provide virtual trainings. Then we had to. So I think you're right. There's a lot of tools that a lot of violence prevention education and nonprofits in general have had to kind of pick up really quickly. And then how can we keep that going, and what worked and what didn't work, and kind of learn from that? Absolutely. So with that, where do you think, the future of prevention education is actually going? Where specifically do you want it to go?
I think we've touched probably on a lot of things that we want throughout, but I think for me, there's a couple different key points. One of them is that I'm really interested in actually trying to understand, and this is maybe more of a research piece than a actual prevention piece, but understanding why perpetrators perpetrate and how we prevent them from perpetrating. That I am so interested in actually preventing violence before it occurs. And so understanding that piece is so key, and we're just not there yet. And so there needs to be more on the research side. Another key piece for me, and I'll just do one more and then I'll stop, otherwise I'll keep going all day. Another key piece is really understanding, again, and we just talked about the overlaps of the different isms and how they're related to sexual violence, so that we know that we should be addressing racism and homophobia and sexism together, but we don't actually really understand how. Even though we know that we should do it, we don't necessarily know how to do it in an effective way. So I would love to see more prevention education programs that are trying to do that, so that we can really look at the effectiveness of those programs and pick out the pieces that are working well, and then again, scale those up and apply those and bring those out to the community as well.
So everything Julia said, right? And I think I'd like to see more partnership with other communities, right? Besides who's largely driven the movement, because we go out and talk to or at a lot of times, but can we start and maybe this is shifted more than I realize, can we shift that more to be conversations that are conversations, right, that are back and forth to create prevention strategies that are going to work in a lot of different settings? Like, what's the core that works across settings, and then what's the process for how we get this to work in different places? So this is something that everybody can see themselves having a place in, because this is something that happens to everyone, but it manifests in different ways. So I think that's a lot of hard work and a lot of introspection. So many agencies are just trying to keep the doors open day to day, right, and meet the folks that are coming in. So I absolutely get that and hear that. So, but we've got to get more people coming in, not just for our intervention services, right, but for our prevention, or at least we need to be partnered with more people on our prevention service.
Yeah, that primary and secondary prevention piece, right? As a final question for you both, again, Is there anything that you'd like to add or mention that we may not have covered? Or is there anything that you would like to say to educators or survivors out there?
I mean, I would kind of like to say that we can round this out maybe in a cheesy way that's less academic, but thank you. So Emilie, I know that you're an educator and this is really hard work. And that sometimes, like we talked about before, you want to bang your head against a wall because you feel like things aren't changing. So remember that how far we've come, that we have so much to do, but that really I would like to thank kind of the educators out there, the people actually doing the prevention work on the ground, because I know this is hard, frustrating work, but it is so vitally important.
Yeah, and I want to thank everyone who shares their experiences about this, both those who have experienced sexual violence directly and all of us indirectly, right? This has been over 20 years for me, and we have come a long way. Sometimes I have to turn around and look and realize that the careers that we have, and this is not about us having jobs, but like these are made possible now because people are caring and there are resources here to support people. There are places to go. There are virtual places to go. There are brick and mortar places to go, right? There's so much more I can do now when a student sits in my chair, because my goal is that chair in my office has a semester that no one discloses a sexual assault to me, not because they don't feel comfortable talking to me, but because there isn't one to disclose, right? But I see so many more people bringing this up in my class. I am not always the one, and in my classes, like in Intro to Sociology or in Criminology, that brings these things up and brings these things up in a much more sophisticated way and less myth-driven way than the past. So I think, thanks to all that came before, the men, the women, the folks of all gender, the Me Too's, right? Because it has propelled us forward. And while I get there will be setbacks, I don't think we're ever going back to what we had, right? People talk. And the younger generation is better at talking about this than the generations before. So I think there's so much potential on the horizon.
I love it. And thank you so much. And I think that that's a wonderful place to sign off. So I'd like to thank the listener for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so much, Julia and Alison, for joining me today.
Thanks, Emilie.
Thank you.